You are,
I'm
yeah.
professor in fashion business management. I think I've been teaching for, I don't know, 21 years or so.
Hi, I'm Audrey. I'm in the science and math department, and I've been at FIT for, yes, two and a half years.
Quite a time to join, right?
Yeah, it's been
And
wild.
Jane, you're there, right?
Yes, I am. Hello.
And Jane is also
Yes, I'm in the FBM department for 30 years.
right. That's
Bad
girl after my
connection.
own heart. I'm Rebecca. Rebecca Bauman's from the foreign language. From no, it's not foreign language. It's
Modern
from
languages and
modern
cultures.
languages and cultures, right? I have it engraved on my arm, right?
Hello, everyone. I am also in the FBM department, and like Naomi, I've been teaching in FBM for 21 years this year.
Wow, it's getting up there.
Yeah,
Time is erasing, huh? Yeah.
yeah.
And Shelley, I think I remember when you were brand new, Shelley.
Yes, well, I started as a student, so I started as a student, then an adjunct, and then full time. I became full time 11 years ago. Is that correct? Wow, that seems like a long time. I think, yeah, so I'm also in fashion business management.
Elaine called me about a month or so ago, and we were just talking about wanting to put together an event where we could just talk about pedagogy and how pedagogy is responding to the changes we're seeing in our students and our delivery methods, and not necessarily just make it all about pandemic all the time or make it all about technology, but rather just a good conversation about practice. And some of the things that I've been thinking about, I'm teaching this semester. Many of you know that I teach occasionally. Um, I'm teaching EN 121. And what I found in my class is that the first 3 weeks, people were very excited to be here. And that excitement is kind of going away at this point. And I was really interested in hearing what Naomi was saying about her experience, which sounds a little bit like the opposite of what I'm experiencing, but that might just be due to disciplinary differences. But also at the same time, I'm I'm noticing some changes in student expectations around what they want from us and how we can communicate with them and how we can help them navigate the material that we're presenting. But meanwhile, I'm also noticing these other kinds of changes, especially as a teacher of writing and somebody who's really interested in literacy, with the intersection of technology, communication, and students' abilities to really dig deep into material. Um, when I was setting up my syllabus for this semester, which I had to do sort of last minute, I was asked to teach to fill in for somebody who was unable to take their courses this semester. I was looking for high quality articles for students to read that were in accessible places. And I was just reflecting on the fact that 20 years ago, it was so much easier to find those articles. And now it's difficult to find things that really dig in deep, that go beneath the surface. They exist, they're out there, but they're not as widely accessible, I think. Uh, this at least was my experience. And I started thinking about, well, maybe that's just because the way we communicate is really changing fundamentally. And I'm wondering how that might be playing out within the different disciplines in terms of how students are finding materials or doing about research. So that's sort of where these questions are coming from, at least the questions that I had a hand in developing.
So Brian, I just posted an article that was in the Chronicle of Higher Ed that I got this morning. It was talking about writing and how instrumental writing is to helping students understand and synthesize and come to their own conclusions. And I was like, oh, because we're doing more writing on our program than we ever have. And this article really just reinforced how beneficial that is for all of us.
You know, Naomi, Brian, and I have done many events with titles like Writing for Learning.
Yeah.
And when you were talking earlier about the fact that students forgot how to take notes, I really got like a chill, because we know that the combination of your eyes, your hand, and your brain, you know, really promotes learning. So the fact that we've left out that whole experience to think about the downside and what, you know, how that could be diminishing what's going on in your classroom.
Yeah.
So absolutely. It's funny exactly what we were talking about.
I've been thinking about that. I know that a lot of people are increasing the amount of writing that they're asking students to do. But we're not necessarily seeing an increase in the number of students coming to us. And I think that that's something that I'd like to work through with the faculty and try to figure out. And I can imagine that there might be kinds of writing situations where students don't feel like they really need to go to the writing and speaking studio. So we've been trying to think about how we communicate to students about our services as not just a place to go sort of tinker with your writing, but to find a thinking partner
Oh,
and
I
to
like
find
that.
somebody who's going to help you work through ideas and really consider any kind of a prompt from all perspectives. So, and I think that might be our sort of next place to go. So I'm glad to hear that there's more writing going on. I think creating stronger partnerships it might be the next step. So.
You know, it's interesting. There's that book, Writing to the Bone or Writing Down the Bone, that Amy Lemon recommended to me. And there's one passage in particular that I talk to my students about all the time. And it's simply that, you know, if you're writing for pleasure or you're a journaler, you're doing it all the time. But students may graduate from here from a business degree, may walk into a job and they're being asked to write a memo to somebody and they've never had the experience of doing it. They haven't practiced. And, you know, that's kind of the writing focus that I put on the courses that I teach. It's, you know, you got to practice. It's not, you know, it just doesn't magically happen overnight.
Being able to write is having power.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you can get what you want. You can make people understand. You can get money. You know, you can, you know, if you have that power. You know, sometimes students, you know, I'm an art school kid too, and I remember thinking, you know, and when I first started to write in my work, I was a classic artist writer with way too many adjectives and poor grammar. But once I learned to like load my tool belt, you know, it was like what I could get back, you know, because I had that skill. And I've said that to engineering and art students so many times. It is for you. You need it. You know, you need it to get what you want in your career. Writing
Well,
is,
I'd like to make an observation, though. I think that the way that writing is used goes directly to what the assessment strategy is for the class. So there are many many courses I've worked with faculty on where the testing is really much more based on multiple choice, fill in the blank, things that encourage students to jam their memories, like they're stuffing a cannon with gunpowder, and then just blast it all out into that test. The other part of it is the neuroscience of writing in cursive shows such a high retention rate by compared to keystrokes.
right.
There's a reading out there called the pen is mightier than the keyboard,
I love that.
and so I'll just share in my classes. I ask students to handwrite reflections on the course, on the class that week, and submit them on a weekly basis. And they didn't like it, but now they're getting so good at it that they're beginning to realize that at the end of the semester, they're going to have a record that is not just their notes, but what they thought about their notes. And one of the questions is, what did you learn from somebody else in the class, you know, about what we covered? And so I think that testing directs students often away from actually writing narrative form. And that a lot of times narrative form that I see is based on uh, reports on readings that they're given. Okay, and so, and I think that Brian could talk about this much better than me, but a lot of the written assignments do not ask students to compare and contrast ideas. So if you're not comparing Macy's to Gimbals, to use like an antique phrase, right? Then what you'll know less about either of them if you don't compare them to each other, you know? So
Yeah, I want
I think those are points I'm seeing, and I wanted to just throw it out to everybody that I think the hardest part of teaching these days with a written component is asking really good questions.
I'd like to jump in.
to,
if I
I'm
sure.
may.
done.
Yeah.
I teach primarily online, and I start off my courses explaining to the students or stating to the students that I am teaching this course, I'm running this course like a business. I am your supervisor. You will be communicating with me. And when I give assignments, which are primarily starts off being the discussions, I require that they write in a discussion, not like they're writing in TikTok or Instagram, and no abbreviations, but writing and communicating with each other. And I jump in and make note or maybe a polite or business-like comment when I see otherwise. But when I'm asking them to compare and contrast in different articles, I explain to them, or when I'm asking them to research, Google is not the only resource in the world. That's the whole point. It's not just Google. And I have found that I usually have to give them some lead, let's say crumbs for food for thought, and giving them questions of items in the content or the articles that I may provide that I want them to look for, to think about, and to consider. If I'm not giving them an article and it's just research, yes, I'm still giving them pointers, recommendations, suggestions that I think will make them think about what they're looking for and how they're going to respond. So I try continuously to also ask them questions. So if I'm asking them questions, which is something that Jane Werner taught me a long time ago, if I'm asking them questions at the right time that really encourages more discussion, more conversation and thought, that also helps. But it is definitely a challenge today to get students away from thinking, oh, all I have to do is Google it and give her what she wants. It's not what I want. It's what you are learning and what you are going to earn. I'm not giving you anything. This is what you are learning and what you're going to get out of this course. And so I think those are kind of ways that I approach it online, and it is challenging unless I get usually one of Naomi's one-year program students, and that's a little bit less of a challenge. But I find that the power of suggestion and early on in the course, even showing them, look at the references that I've used, look at the resources of the content in the contents that I have used, and follow that lead, if you will, rather than just Googling to get information, because this is not a social media class.
So Renee, let me ask you there was this third question that I believe Brian had put together, which I think just feeds right into this, is that what effect, positive or negative, is digital communication, things like blogs, social media, etc., having on the students' critical thinking skills? This is
that is definitely what I was thinking about. I think it's been hard. It's a lot of negativity because they don't think. They're only responding to what they see in front of them. And even responding to each other is just what they see in front of them. They don't take the time to stop and think. And that's the problem I find with social media. I may refer to TikTok and Instagram somewhere in my course, so I let them know I'm aware. But I'm doing that to let them know that I'm aware that that's not the be all end all. That's not what we're here to talk about. That's not here what we're here to use as a tool to prepare you to face the business world. And so I think it is, I guess it's not always negative, but for the most part, I would say that social media and digital communication is very, very limiting. And blogs, I find, I try not to refer to blogs because, as Brian had said, or I read somewhere, they don't sort through what's true and what's not true in a blog.
Right.
A blog is a single bit of information from someone's opinion. It's not a full resource. giving unbiased information. So I really do not reference blogs, and I don't ask them to. I don't allow Wikipedia in my courses, and I made that statement on preview week.
I'm dying to hear from Rebecca.
I was just going to do the same thing.
Thank you. Sorry, I mean, sort of chiming in on a lot of this. One, I can't even tell you as somebody who teaches foreign language, how detrimental the lack of handwriting is to memory and processing. But that's a whole other thing. But in terms of the writing and exactly what Renee was just talking about, I think one of the worst things about all of these, the writing online that students are encountering and participating in is that what I've noticed is that they seem to be absolutely unable to moderate their voice in their writing in class, so that they have no idea of the distinctions between what is appropriate for blogs or for tweets or for an Instagram thing, or versus what kind of voice they should be adopting in certain kinds of, say, a discussion forum versus an academic paper. And there are different levels. I mean, my expectations for a discussion forum are very different than for a research paper. But I truly believe that in some cases they just cannot understand when they need to change registers in their voice. And so I see a lot of really inappropriate writing. And it's hard to sort of communicate to them because they're seeing so much of that kind of voice, of that use of colloquialisms and just complete disregard for spelling or punctuation, as well as just, in terms of what they're, the content.
Yeah. So, I mean, what can we do? I mean, how are you addressing that? I mean, it's like, I mean, whether it's developing critical thinking skill to be able to decide between truth or fiction, and being able, like, appropriate writing style, for a blog, and as opposed to a research paper. Like, what do we do to help students, grapple with those two topics?
I think one of the things that I do, especially for the online, which is a bit more of a challenge, certainly, but in the online discussion forums, like Renee, I set the standard very early, and I actually do a whole written expectation in a discussion forum. A lot of students come to an online class thinking, oh, I responded, so I get 100%. And you start right off the bat giving them a grade that's reflective of the writing and the contribution. They learn pretty quickly. The other thing I find that's a challenge is this credible sourcing. So what is credible? So what I've done to help them is, I love the new tools, the FIT library sync tools, because what I do is I add a nugget on Blackboard on the left-hand side that says credible sources and APA citations, so that they go straight into credible sources. And there's a whole list of fashion, business, management resources that they use. They just have a challenge with, they would rather go to Google, look up a term for the course and put that as a definition, versus looking at the textbook or looking at, what's actually, a source that might be appropriate for them to use in the course. So the links in Blackboard have really changed the, quality of what students are now using as sources in my online classes.
Did any of you, by any chance, there was a few years ago, I had done an event with Helen in the library, and it was really fascinating because going to a website for information, students not being able to determine, actually the faculty in the workshop couldn't really determine that sometimes there was a website that was very enticing and looked like it would have all the answers, and it eventually just took you to a completely bogus place. And it was around the time they were developing some of those tools that you were describing, Shelley, because I mean, when it really hit, it was just seemed to be all this information, and then when we drilled down, we realized so much of it was bogus or inaccurate, and how to guide students navigating through that information. I I have a daughter-in-law who's a journalist that one time said to me years ago, "Oh, don't believe anything on there." You know, so I became, you know, and I'm like, you know, somebody who was educated the old-fashioned way. So, you know, here students are faced with this enormous amount of information, and you know, at the same time, not developing those kind of critical thinking skills that would help them navigate. You know, it's, you know, what we can do to address those issues. I mean, Brian, you must be dealing with that when students come in with a research assignment, you know, on helping them, you know, slog through that.
Yeah, all the time. I mean, we're constantly, you know, pushing people toward the library actually, and saying, "Hey, I think maybe you should." One of the things that's been wonderful about the library is that they've opened up a lot of opportunities for students to meet with them one-to-one, and to connect with them almost immediately. You know, you chat with the librarian, and we'll use that during our sessions, especially if we think there's time. You know, sometimes there's not always time, and it can be a very difficult conversation about you know, source material if something is due in 45 minutes, and whether or not the source material was adequate or is really helping you answer the questions or helping substantiate the claims that you're making. So yeah, it is a challenge, but I think sort of the greater challenge is talking to students about how knowledge is built and constructed, and the fact that all of it needs to be vetted. Even knowledge that you're getting from quote unquote reputable sources can change. I mean, I think we've all felt this, have experienced this over the course of the pandemic, where as we learn more about, and I kind of wish Audrey was still here because I think maybe she would know more about this, but as we learn more about coronavirus, right, and how it behaves, and you know, how it goes from how it's sorry, what's the word I'm looking for? Uh, the level of contagiousness,
Transmitted.
and how, yeah, and you know, we feel like we live in a society where we want the answer to be simple and direct, right? But the reality is we learn more as we move along, and the answers change, and things change, and our knowledge about things change, right? And students need to kind of be uncomfortable with that and to understand that they're actually a part of that process, right? So as they're developing their expertise in all of these different areas, we're expecting them to engage these conversations and not only gather and learn and you know, synthesize information, but then also to contribute to it in some way, right? And I think that that's a really hard thing to get people to feel comfortable with and help them understand. And I think once they do start understanding that, it's easier for them to look at pieces and vet them and to say, okay, what should I be skeptical about? What are the kinds of things that are still in development? What are the kinds of things that are sort of we know, we feel like we know for sure because they've been around for a long time. And those are the tools that I think are more beneficial ultimately because they're transferable from one context to the next. And you know, we're in the business of helping students try to develop some transferable skills, you know, so they can take something from one class and bring it to the next. But also in terms of just writing in general and communication, um, there are certain things that they might be able to take from one communication situation to another communication situation, but not all those things go with it from one situation to the next. So, for instance, you know, when Rebecca was talking about her expectations for a discussion forum post versus research paper, right? We're going to have vastly different ideas about what that writing should look like or what should be involved, right? The level of citation, all of these things. Um, so there are lots of mixed messages, I think is my point, that students are getting. And I think it's in part our job to help them sort of work their way through these things, right? I don't know.
You know, I have you know, I was, you know, I remember when I first came, Renee, I think you were working on a course that was called Ethics in Retail. And or maybe it was my first time on the curriculum committee, but I remember being very impressed with that course, you know. And I think I would only assume, because I don't remember, you know, what all the details of the course, but the brevity of digital communication, you know, does it leave students just skilled to be able to respond to factual writing? Or can they read something, you know, in a course that talks about ethics and respond to that equally well? You know, I don't know. I mean, I'm not in the classroom right now. And, you know, the world has changed a bit. And I don't know whether students are equally prepared to deal with conversations and readings about ethics as they are with just factual matter. And whether the brevity of digital communication, you know, is you know, one of the stressors. I just don't know. I mean, any of you have feelings about that? Because this was one of the items that Brian and I were talking about at one
I
point.
do, Elaine. I don't remember the course because you and I have worked on many things together, fortunately. But I do think that I like something that Brian said. It is our responsibility to prepare students to be able to develop transferable skills, to recognize those transferable skills. And it's not just about, have I worked in a retail store, so therefore can I do this job when I leave? It's building all of the soft skills, I think we would call them as well. But I think in terms of ethics, it's something that if students don't select to take that particular subject as a liberal arts, it is something that I think, and everyone in FBM can correct me, in many ways is built into the FBM curriculum as part of what we are teaching as a tool to prepare students. That's why I like to run my course as a business course, because it's about learning the content and it's about how students work through it. It's you're working like you're in a job, but ethics is is a big part of it. And I think that also goes to the writings in terms of, we tell students that plagiarism is illegal. Plagiarism is punishable. And that's an ethical question as well. And I think documentation, everything I put in my course is APA cited. So I expect the same from the students, even online discussions, everything must be APA cited. To me, that's an ethical question. It's not your content. You don't own it. You didn't create it. So who did?
But Renee,
yeah.
just my question is, and this is a question I hear from a lot of faculty here and also where I teach, is who's teaching them about plagiarism? Who's teaching them about proper attribution? You know,
Aren't
that
we teaching that in our courses? Isn't it built into our concourse syllabus?
Yeah, but what I'm saying to you is even before they come to you, unless you're teaching freshman level, you know, what are we doing to instill that from the get-go?
Okay.
And, you know, and I do understand, and I know there are other people in FBM who insist on proper attribution in all cases all the time. And I think that's great. But what I guess I'm suggesting is I think that some people don't know the difference between a paraphrase and a plagiarize. And I would bet you that if you were to test the student body by and large, you would get a very, very colorful array of answers.
I think if you surveyed the faculty, you'd get a colorful array of answers.
Well,
You know,
by the way, the faculty, and I can say this as a faculty developer, are atrocious about attributing their sources and the images and the quotes. So, you know, and they'll admit it when they're called on it, but, you know, if you're going to ask somebody for something and you put up an image without a credit.
Right. If I put up one of my own images, I give myself credit, but in the proper format.
You deserve the credit, you know, because.
Hey, I want to ask you guys something, especially for those of you that have been at FIT for a really long time. I mean, do you see changes in student skills that we could maybe blame on our world today? I mean, or how have the students changed in this regard? And in regard to being able to grapple with, you know, complex reading. I mean, do you see differences or not?
I think it's the same thing, Elaine. I think because I find it's always refreshing when I meet students for the first time and we talk about, you know, what do you do outside of school? When I get a student who says they love to read, or they read poetry, or they read novels, or they read this genre. I mean, but that's less common than it used to be. And because they spend so much time on their phone with all the digital tools that they have at their fingertips. So, you know, I think that's really challenging, and I try to provide a forum for them where we can share things that are not social digital tools, sharing, you know, cultural activities, sharing novels that people are reading, poetry that people, you know, connect with, you know, gallery exhibitions, just to try to encourage the students to explore things that they, you know, kind of have taken out of their tool belt, as you say. You know, I was in Chicago in August, and I saw this amazing exhibition by this artist who lives here in New York. Her name is Bisa Butler, and she does this incredible work with textiles. So I spent a lot of time talking about her, and I brought in the catalog, and I said, you know, look at the catalog. It's got all this rich information about how she came to this, and you know, to read things and not just look at things at face value.
Yeah.
And I said to them, I said, look, I went to the exhibition. I was really taken with what she does. So I took a deep dive to learn more about who she is and about what influenced her. And I was gratified to see that some of the students actually did a little research.
Oh, nice.
But the other thing too that I just wanted to say is, in every one of my classes today, at the very beginning of the semester, before they can submit their first assignment, I require them all to read the college's honor policy. And I put together a one-page document, and it's an integrity agreement. And in there, it just gives sort of the short headline of what FIT expects of its students and why it's so important that the ideas are their own. I take it right out of there. I said, this is like the preamble to this document. You must read this document. You must sign and date this document.
For you.
And I reinforce it throughout the semester because, you know, I mean, I will put something into Google because I'm like, this is not that person's voice.
Yeah.
Sure enough, hello. But
Just
I'll
as an FYI.
I'll cite it and I'll say, and you sign this document, you need to go back and read it again.
Just as a FYI, and then I know there's a question to Brian, that next week on the 9th, Carly is in the library, is going to do a session on copyright. And even though I know Carly always begins her session saying, I cannot give you any legal advice, she happens to be a member of the bar in Massachusetts and New York in copyright. So if you really want to get you know, some real facts next week. It's not an RSVP. You can just, you know, log in, whatever. But I've always found, and she talks not only about scholarly, you know, infringement, but she's also talking about visual arts. So it should be a very good. Anyway, Brian, I know there was a question there about accidental plagiarism.
Sure. I mean, there are a couple of things that I could talk about. And the first is, you know, it's not as under theorized as it once was, but plagiarism is something that people didn't spend a lot of time really digging into and thinking about on a very theoretical level. And once people started to do that, they were thinking about, well, what's the process of writing, for instance, and how do we go about writing? And Jeffrey was talking earlier about students who have difficulty with, for instance, paraphrasing, right? There's a lot that we learn as we learn to write, and there's a lot that we learn about synthesis. There's a lot that we learn about, you know, drawing on the ideas of others and how we ensure that credit is given where credit is due. And there can be times where students aren't sophisticated enough in that process, and they end up doing what actually plagiarism is. You know, they plagiarize, right? But the question is, did they commit fraud? Were they really trying to pass somebody else's work off as their own? Or were they going through the kind of process that we all go through as we're developing our writing skills, which is kind of a process of being a patch writer, you know, thinking about how you draw from different areas and bring it into your own understanding, and then how you communicate outward what you're making of those sources. And in that process, it can get kind of messy at times. And I think that writing teachers think very carefully about this, obviously, because we care about helping students get to that place where they learn how to internalize the words and thoughts of others and being able to represent that through their own language and their own voice, while also making sure that they are attributing those ideas to the other people. But it's not an easy thing to do. And actually, out of all of the major writing concerns I see at FIT, I think most of them have to do with students being comfortable with paraphrasing and with synthesizing information. So in my EN 121 class, a lot of what I'm trying to do is get students to look at a large number of sources, at least 10, and start thinking about the patterns that they're seeing. So what themes are emerging from their sources, and how can they categorize the work that they're thinking about with those themes, and draw together from those texts some kind of a statement that's interesting or new. So there's a little bit of comparison and contrast in that. There's a little bit of trying to create a conversation around an issue or a problem. And it's not an easy task. And I think that we could be doing more to engage our students in that practice. And I think we should worry less about always having them achieving perfection with it, and worry more about giving them as many opportunities to practice with that as we can. And sometimes the plagiarism thing gets really caught up in the conversation around creating a perfect text, and fails to recognize that learning to write is a process, and it involves sometimes messiness, it involves sometimes accidents, it involves sometimes, bad decisions. And so I think that we just have to kind of like reframe the way we think about these things from time to time. And that's not to say that there aren't people out there who are definitely going to just cheat. That happens. And I think we recognize when it happens. I mean, I've had people in my classes who have, blatantly plagiarized, and, I knew it wasn't a matter of, process, or of like, stumbling along the way of the path of learning, but it was more about them, not wanting to do the work and just taking something from somewhere else and making it there, passing it off on as their own. So that's where I see fraud. That's fraud. That's versus accidental plagiarism, when you're just maybe not a great paraphraser, or you're maybe not used to the kinds of expectations we have for academic writing here in the academy in the United States or wherever. So
Thank you, Brian. As usual, you've given us great food for thought.
I was just going to say something about, we were, in the olden days when we were doing student faculty roundtables, with a big lunch and all that, we had done this event. I never forgot. One of the students came back to report on what they had discussed at the table, and there were a lot of A&D people at that table. And the student announced, and Jeffrey is also an art school kid like me, so I bet you he, his ears perked up as well. When the student reported back, the student said, "Oh, I never turn in my best work for my project," because the fear of plagiarism was so huge.
Visual plagiarism.
yeah, she was afraid they were going to steal her work.
Yes, that she'd much rather get a slightly lower grade and keep the best one secret. And that, I mean, if that's what's on the street, that really frightened me a little bit.
Yeah, but that was always a problem. You go into a painting class and you'll see three people painting like two others, It's not only a matter of this notion, right, that they're so incredibly brilliant and outstanding that their idea is going to light the world if somebody else takes it, is not what school is about, right?
Right.
School is about, sharing.
I agree with you.
No, I'm just
all
sort of saying with
process,
I spoke to that young man and I said, let me tell you something. If you've got a great idea, there's more where that came from,
Exactly. That's the thing to tell
and
them. Absolutely.
you
That's
know, it's
exactly
not like you're selling
right.
something that nobody else can create. If anything, I think that most people would agree that achievements and success are more
Right.
nuanced, right? They're more, they're more of a growth, an organic growth
The best
process
message.
than they are.
And to say, like you'll do it again and it'll be better next time, it's my feelings too.
After that
Yeah.
conversation, I was on the Academic Integrity Council, which was, something that Jeff Buckman wanted to create, and it involved Jack Oliva and what's the long gone Kelly Brennan.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, and one of the things that I was really pushing for was to redefine academic integrity at FIT to be about our interest in you creating your best
Right.
work. So instead of it being about being a punitive thing, which a lot of academic integrity policies are really focused on. So if you violate the rules, we're going to do this to you, or you're going to, get the academic death penalty and you're out of here. Really to reframe it in terms of this is about success. This is about you engaging in high quality, wonderful work. And that's what we're interested in. That's academic integrity to us at FIT. I'm not so sure how much it caught on, but I wanted to sort of, look at this from a perspective of, for the most part, we're dealing with students who are interested in doing good work. They're the majority. The ones who want to cheat and the ones who don't want to do the work, I think, are more in the minority. But
Well, we're all very,
you can
very
disagree with me, but I feel
No, I
like
do agree
that's
with you,
been my
Brian, and
experience.
I agree with you for even a kind of maybe a pretty simplistic reason that people sometimes forget what makes a school like FIT very unusual is that students want desperately to be here. And they may very often have gone against their parents, what their parents would like, or um, they're so excited and to be here and to do the work that the faculty know how to do. It's a lot of schools, you just have students that are kind of lost. They have to go to college and they're searching around. That's not the case here. And you've got a very, very unusual student body in that regard. But and I really do agree with you, Jeffrey. This is not a time to be creating, the museum pieces. But I guess when you're 18, you feel like that may be what you did. And,
Well, I do think, I think it's an issue if a student feels that their work's going to get swiped,
so be it for
on
that.
somebody else.
That's
But, those are ethical issues that we've all had, right? Even when we were kids in school, when people were looking over each other's shoulders and,
yeah.
and cribbing. With a little bit of time left, the last question I thought was a really good one that maybe.
I want to make one more comment though about the fear that students have about having their work, taken from them, or, given how digital we become. I mean, these students, like, think about the Chalk FIT, right? It's out there. I'm sure they're taking pictures of it. They're putting it on their social. Even in FBM, I know you're working towards students creating e-portfolios, right? And so they have these digital repositories where they're putting their work. And I think this fear of other people being able to take it is shouldn't be so great at this point, because there could be a point of origin there to prove, no, I posted this to my Instagram account in 2020. You can't say that you made it for yourself in 2022, right? Like so there are affordances, is my point, to having digital communication and having access to it and students engaging in it. And I think that we need to help them leverage it in smarter ways.
And also, Brian, we live in a world where privacy is becoming, a vintage word, and maybe the students' approaches to, to how important is privacy, may also change the way you know, people look at that as well. I'm not ready to go there, but I see that, you know, it's young people have a very different feeling about privacy than I do. I know I'm gonna, Jeffrey wanted to address one of the questions, and I'm gonna turn this over to him about that. But I was also going to say to you is that if we don't have time, like live here, I'm really very interested in knowing what you think that maybe the CET can do for you with regard to these topics. You know, what kind of resources could we develop? What kind of programming could we maybe add on? And I really would love to hear from you in that regard, because I think that what we're talking about today, I think it's really critical for education and where it goes, you know, moving forward. So anyway, I'll turn that over to Jeffrey. So you wanted to deal with this last question here?
Well, I thought that, you know, this morning we have a student aide here, and I just always ask her how school's going, just more to be supportive that if she's having like a freak out, you know, a lot of times if we're not that busy, we'll actually let them spend some time, you know, getting themselves organized. And she said, you know, I have this class that's a lecture class, and it takes me a half hour to get to school and a half hour to get back. And all we do is listen to a lecture and look at slides.
I can't
And
believe I'm
after
still
having,
doing this.
well, you know, it used to be you didn't question that, right? Because you had to come to school no matter what.
Yeah.
But I think all of us as workers, right, and as teachers, as well as participants in society, have discovered that there are some things that are just easier done other ways.
Yeah.
And, you know, so I thought maybe some people wanted to comment on that. I mean, I have very strong feelings about it, but we don't have time for my feelings. I'd like to hear what other people have to say. Starting with Rebecca, how about that?
Well, I just can't conceive of giving a lecture that doesn't have space for conversation and questions and dialogue with students. So I'm wondering, is this a student who just would never ask a question or would never participate, or is this really an instructor who is teaching it as if they're, you know, on
It-
stage facing
Yeah, I was
the
going to say,
wall?
we do have
I asked the
Broadway
question,
theater teachers.
and
We have
there are
them.
very few accessible tasks, and they're treated more like data dumps. And I think that the question you're asking, Rebecca, though, is one that all teachers have to ask themselves all the time, right? Is, am I getting interaction with the students while I'm delivering information? And everybody has those aw shucks classes at the end where you say, oh my God, it was bloviation without interaction. And, you know, that is a problem. But I think there's a lot of things that you guys learned, you know, during the year and a half before this fall, you know, that the question is, are we setting aside great opportunities because we're going back to what we were before, or should we be a better version of ourselves? And I'll throw that to Jane.
Yeah.
Classroom management strategies here, you know?
I mean, what things?
Well, of course, we need to be able to combine both. I mean, that's the answer to it. But the thing is how. And I teach math in the FBM department. And for me, I think it's about giving the students many opportunities to
Be
practice.
online tomorrow.
We can tell them how they should research. We can tell them, we can show them which are the credible sources. We can bring them to the library and to the writing center and all of those places. But then really, I think what matters is how many opportunities we give them to actually practice it. They don't want to practice. They're into nuggets and sound bites and
Yeah.
quick. And that I think has hurt their ability to focus for longer periods of time. They want it fast. They want it quick. Give me the shot, and now I can multiply and divide. You know, and that, as far as I know, it doesn't work that way. And
You know,
so
Jane, I think
they have to practice.
it would be great to compare the outcomes this semester with the courses that you taught remotely. A lot of faculty told me that they were astonished at the quality of the work they got while they were teaching remotely. And I'm not just talking about the more predictable areas, including in art and design. Anybody want to toss in a few chips on that one? Let's see.
See, Naomi,
Sally.
Sure, I think that well, so one of the big aha moments for me this semester, going from remote into person. So the remote, I do agree, remote really provided a lot of opportunity for students to put forth great work, and part of it is availability, being there, being able to, communicate with the students after class in a remote setting. They were comfortable asking questions on Blackboard through the virtual. What I find coming back to the classroom is that, students are having a tough time focusing for the 3 hour period, the 2 hour and 50-minute period. And I think what ends up happening is I have some students in second semester that have never been to college. So it's like this is their first college experience, and they're having a really tough time just being focused in the classroom. So I've had to try to change some of my teaching techniques to really make sure students are understanding what's being presented, and then giving them opportunities to break out in sessions, do a little work, come back to the classroom. But I know now by seeing assignments this semester, they're not at the same level as they were when I was remote teaching. When I'm comparing remote teaching last semester and what I'm seeing with assignments this semester.
can I say something interesting, an observation my husband made? He teaches architecture. He was expecting the worst going remote. And he said to me, the work the students did was amazing. He was like blown away. He couldn't believe it. But we were talking about it once, and he thought some of it was because they couldn't go out, that their lives were much more limited, and so they were so fully focused on the work he was doing. I mean, it was very unexpected. So I'm not saying that's the reason, but I'm saying that it may have fed into some of those results, I think.
Yeah, and when students were remote, they weren't traveling to school, they weren't
Exactly.
working in the field, there weren't all these right now they're having a tough time with time management,
Right.
because now they're commuting, now they're coming to the classroom and they're working.
Seeing
So
their friends, I mean, they're young, it's, I just thought it was an interesting observation. I hadn't thought about that, but I think probably it fed into it.
I was teaching developmental writing last fall, and I found that the students in that course completed more work than in previous semesters, but didn't do as well.
Oh, that's interesting.
They didn't get as far by the end of the semester as past classes did. And that might have been my fault, but I felt like they were motivated to go to class to get the work done, but they could only do as much as they could do. And it was harder to get them to dig a little deeper. And it might have just been that my methods weren't as
Or
fine-tuned
maybe they just
in that
need more
environment.
intimate support that was
But I
hard
think
to
they
give.
just needed more time than what I could give them remotely. So
I found that the students did better last semester after a semester of teaching remotely because I did record my sessions and they could go back. And because of that, it actually allowed us to have more higher level conversation when we were talking to each other. So I flipped my class this semester and I'm seeing the same results.
That's
So
interesting.
I think that's a little harder to do in a writing class,
Yeah.
just because they are the content,
right.
so and that makes it for a little bit of a challenge. And I do think being in a room together and being able to have really authentic and organic workshops around ideas makes the difference for that kind of a class.
Yeah.
But I was impressed with how many of them kept up with the work, because that's always the real challenge, especially with developmental writing. Normally I lose people because they don't keep up with things. And that might have been because they're managing so many things in their lives, but during the remote learning time, they were just at home and all they had to do is kind of log on. And
Well, but like look at the situation we're in now. Like if I cold call Shelley or Jane, right? It's not the same as in a classroom where there's multiple distractions. Even though there's a bunch of us online, Shelley is talking directly to us while she's sitting alone in her office. So there's a level of low distraction, high focus that goes on when you're interacting that way that is much, much more difficult to achieve in an open classroom. And also, I found it's easier to identify the quiet ones and kind of bring them out a little bit when you're working remotely than when you're working in a classroom. Now, I am not saying that makes one better than the other. I think it depends on content and the objectives. But I think that to go as if we never had this issue, this experience, and to go back to teaching the way we did, I think is a huge mistake without looking at the innovative discoveries we've made. And also, there's a lot of critical commentary that came out today about things, like we don't have time to go into the tools, but a lot of the tools that we use technology wise also make very low demand on the depth and complexity of the response. So a lot of things get blog like or oversimplified. And I think that it's just a process, right, that we have to churn our way through. I'm so glad that we have to have another one of these that maybe even goes broader.
Yeah. Yes,
Don't you guys agree?
yeah, I'm very glad that we had a chance to talk a little bit. It makes me think about what else we could be doing, with faculty in this regard. And
I want to just make one quick observation before we sign off, and everybody on this call right now are people who I think of as being, experienced and really thoughtful and mindful teachers. And I just think it's really interesting that this is the group that showed up today. People who are really, I always think that all of you are people who care so much about what you're doing and the work that you're doing with students and how you're delivering the content in your courses. And I wish that we could take this kind of a group and expand it, and bring it out to everybody across the college, because I think there are a lot of people who would benefit from hearing your collective wisdom, and your experiences.
The problem, Brian, is for every one of them, excluding myself and Elaine and you, there's 8 other faculty who are part-time faculty.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And, and for that reason, and I know probably better than many, because I work with so many of them, that there's some incredible teachers out there that are absolutely killing themselves to teach a beautiful course while they're working in another job or whatever other obligations they have. I think a key maybe would be Elaine often talks about having evening events where people who are working during the day can attend. So is there any way to have virtual martinis? You hold a glass up to the screen and it'll fill you up with your favorite.
too.
Nice to see you all too. I miss you very much. Miss all of you. And I have to say, every time I'm on a committee or get to sit with anything with Brian, he puts little nuggets in my brain that make me go back and work even harder.
Yeah, he does to me too.
Nice. And of course, I love seeing all the FBM faces.
We miss you.
To Brian's point, it's the FBMers. Yes, we care, but maybe record some of these sessions so that they can be played back. Because I used to go to the CEC.
This is recorded.
Yes.
Just to hear what somebody else is doing.
Put in timesheets. I don't know.
I spent an hour last night walking 19 to 22-year-olds through how to navigate through the site to find our webpage.
Yeah, did you notice we're in employee resources, Brian?
Well, we're all over the place. So, and the
amazing,
problem is that if their target audience for this website are young people, right? The prospective students. And I'm sitting there working with a 19-year-old say, well, how do you click through it? How do you figure out how to navigate through this thing to find the things you need? That's not good. Like,
Well,
Oh, but that's another workshop, Brian.
our website is definitely better than the Mike Pillow guy, though.
Yeah, well, oh, that's saying a lot, Jeffrey.
Don't quote.
right,
We have
guys.
to cut that part off of the recording, okay?
Jeffrey, you're the editing kit, so you cut it off.
Anyway, lovely to see you all.
All right, guys.
Ciao.
All right, have
Thanks
a
so
good
much.
Friday and good weekend.
Good day.